Hello, this is Kyle, also known as Alien Dude, and today I am reviewing this Albion Doge sword. And first I want to say, I said Doge, I'm really not positive that's how to pronounce it. I think that's correct for Italian, which is what the sword is inspired by. So that's what I'm going to go with. But it could also be Doge, but I think it's Doge. And this sword is not mine. It is on loan to me by sword friend Pellius, who has been trying to get a Doge for a while, at least a year, I think a couple years at this point. And this was the year for him because before SoCal Sword Fight, I think 2 Doges showed up on Kult of Athena, and he just missed out on them. And then this one showed up at SoCal Sword Fight, and I proxy bought it for him. And then right after SoCal Sword Fight, something like 4 or 5 of them showed up on Kult of Athena. When it rains, it pours, because you never saw these available for a long time. Then all of a sudden, something like 8 of them showed up. So Pellius is finally getting his Doge, and he's graciously allowed me to hold on to this sword for multiple months after SoCal Sword Fight in order to get this review out. So a huge thank you to Pellius. Now it should be said, this is a new sword from Albion, but it is a con sword from Sword Con. So as usual for those swords, they tend to have a few more scuffs and scratches and maybe a few spots of less refined finish due to the nature of a con, of the travel of the sword, the fact that people are picking them up, handling the swords. So it's just a fact of life when you're buying a sword from a con. And the Doge sells for $1,518 in this configuration. It goes up a little bit if you want a more exotic color grip, or if you want the hilt blackened or antiqued. But this one, in this configuration, $1,518. Now the Doge is one of 4 different Type 19 swords that Albion offers. They also have the Machiavelli, the Condottiere, and the Kern, which I already reviewed, link up here and in the description. This one is a little bit more unique than those in that it's an asymmetrical hilt. It has a true edge and a false edge, just based off the fingering here. And a quick correction here, the Condottiere also has a true edge and a false edge. Now, a Type 19 sword would have been seen around the mid-15th century, somewhere around there. And in my opinion, especially the Doge, it's kind of a blend between an arming sword and a side sword. It doesn't, to me, feel like a full-on side sword, but it's definitely more complex hilted than an arming sword. So I kind of consider this to be a proto-side sword. Now, Type 19 swords were pretty varied. You could have some that were single-handed, some that were hand and a half. They typically had a little bit more complex hilts, not always. They usually had multiple fullers in them, usually were hexagonal in cross-section, and were a blend of cut and thrust swords. This sword is a little bit more on the cut side due to the pretty broad profile with not a lot of profile taper, a not particularly acute point, but still a relatively rigid blade, so it can still do some thrusting, but it's not going to be particularly useful against an armored target because this tip is not really going to be all that useful for seeking the gaps in plate mail or trying to bust apart mail. So the hilt on the Doge is a pretty complex one for a medieval sword and pretty complex for an Albion too. In fact, it might be the most complex of the Albions. It'd be right there with the Machiavelli, in my opinion, as the most complex hilts that Albion puts out these days. Let's start with the pommel here, and this is a really cool looking pommel that isn't really any specific oakshot type. I've heard it referred to as kind of a reversed scent stopper, but even then, it's a little bit different all around than any other types that I have seen. Just like pretty much all Albion pommels, it's finished in a satin finish that is a very nice look to it, although there are always some grind lines visible. But the lines here, the actual shape, geometric lines, They're all very, very crisp, very straight and even, but not sharp in anywhere, any place. There's no hot spots on here. You could maybe consider this part right here to be a hot spot, but that would only, I think, be a problem if you're actually gripping that part in your palm. And I don't see why you would ever do that with this sword. When I'm gripping it like this, that's a perfect way to butt the sword, the pommel up against the hand and not worry about the hand slipping down further because the pommel is shaped very well for that. There's also a lot of dimension to the pommel. You can see, this part obviously, it's rounded here and then kind of an inverse rounding there, but also just the center ridge here. This central part starts a little bit thicker at the grip and then tapers in towards the peen where it is actually, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I think that's octagonal actually. Yeah, that's more of an octagonal shape right down here. So there's a lot of dimension to this pommel and it works very, very well. Now there are a few very, very small flaws in the finish here and there, but they are very minor and they don't really, to my opinion, detract from the look of the pommel. If we look at the peen here, you can see that there's a little bit of discoloration here. It could be polished up just a little bit better, but again, not really a problem in my book at least. And it would not be very difficult just to take some fine grit sandpaper or Scotch-Brite pads or something like that and polish this up a little bit if it bothered you. Is it something that should have been caught and fixed? Maybe. Albions have a reputation of being perfection, and that's not the case. They always have some small minor flaws if you want to consider them flaws. It's not a big deal in my book. Some people will disagree. It is interesting to me that the peen is nowhere near as circular as you'll usually see on Albions. This one is definitely a little more roughly shaped, but it's polished in there very well, and you really have to look to even see it. Next up, the grip. I love this grip. It fits my hand so well. It is wider than it is thick, but it also has a swell to it right in the center where it can really fit into the palm of your hand and really help lock the grip into your hand. And then it tapers down in towards the pommel very, very nicely. It's a very effective shape, and it's also just a really nice looking grip. Aside from the shape, which I think looks really nice, the red dye here I think is just gorgeous. It has some depth to it. It's not just one color. There's darker parts of it, and there's not modeling, but it's not a uniform color, which helps bring, like I said, depth to the dye and just makes the grip look really, really nice. The seam here is very easily seen because it is darker. You get some of that darker red right there, but I cannot feel it with my hand at all. Even on the risers, there's no feel to the seam, which is good. That's what I want. And as always with Albion, the transitions from the grip to the pommel and to the crossguard are just absolutely perfect. They cannot be done better. They can be done in different ways, but I have never seen the transitions from the grip to the hilt furniture done better than Albion does. The crossguard on here is the most complex part of the hilt, obviously. We've got the crossguard, we've got a finger ring, and a knuckle bow. And it looks, first off, just amazing. There's something very classy and elegant to my mind about this overall shape, and especially the way the knuckle bow has this slight curve to it. It has such a great look to it. The knuckle bow has some taper and dimension to it. It starts thicker all around over here and then tapers in towards the very tip of it, and it is four-sided, and here it actually starts 1, 2, 3. Looks like hexagonal and then transitions to quadrilateral. And then the finger ring also is four-sided, although it's a much flatter one, and it also tapers in thickness out towards the very end of it. And then this side of the guard is a much more classic style of guard. You could almost call this like a straight type 11 side, because normally a type 11 would curve upward, but this one's just straight. It is cylindrical and it swells out towards the quillen tip here. Just a very nice, iconic look. And the satin finish on here is a little bit rougher than Albion's typical satin finish, and that's probably because there's nooks and crannies that are not easy to get to polish, because, you know, how do you get into this little nook here? How do you get into this corner? How do you get in here? That's the kind of stuff that takes a lot of time and energy to finish super cleanly. And it's one of the reasons you don't see a whole lot of high-end rapiers, for instance, because cleaning up a complex hilt just takes a ton of effort. And while this is a much less complex hilt, it does show some of that slightly less refined look than you would typically see on an Albion. Now, that's not to say it's not refined and poorly done. It isn't. It's well done. It's just got a few more grind lines visible than you might normally see. The gap in the crossguard is a little bit bigger than I would typically see on an Albion, but we're talking very, very minor details here, and it's mostly because of the fullering on the blade that adds basically some extra space around there. It's still very well fitted to the blade and looks very well done to my eye. And now it's time to talk about the business end, the blade. As always, here's my measurements. So this is a complex blade, and there's a lot to talk about. So let's start at the base of the blade and move our way up. So we have 3 fullers here that are 3 different lengths. You've got one central fuller that goes, about a little bit past halfway up the blade. You've got one very short fuller on the true edge and a bit longer of a fuller on the false edge side. There's a very short ricasso here where you put your finger into the ring, and then a considerably longer ricasso on the false edge, and then this really unique spur that comes out of the spine right at the transition from the ricasso to the sharpened false edge. Now, this spur is characteristic of specific swords that Albion and Peter Johnsson have studied, so that's why it's on there. It's a really unique feature. The cross-section of the blade is a very flat hexagonal, and it starts pretty thin at around 4.5 millimeters, and it gets quite thin out near the tip below 2 millimeters. That's overall a pretty thin sword, but it maintains a decent amount of rigidity due to that hexagonal cross-section, and it's a pretty broad hexagonal, so that's how it maintains a good amount of rigidity. But out towards the cutting portion, it is very flat. There's not huge bevels anywhere. So it is designed for good cuts and being able to slice well. The beveling on here that is here is excellent. There's no secondary bevel, no micro bevel. It's apple seated over very nicely and polished very nicely. You know, I have seen recently some Albions where the edge polishing wasn't quite as good as it could be. Here, that's not the case at all. This is a very well done edge on this sword. Talking about the finish on the blade, it is a satin that's very typical for Albion in that you can still see grind lines, but it's a pretty even finish on this one, a little bit more even than I typically see on Albion. And looking down the planes of the blade, there's no rippling at all, very cleanly and evenly finished. The tip has just a tiny bit of a flatness on the very, very tip. So it's not perfectly acute. It has a little bit of, it's not even rounding over, it's a tiny bit of flatness. This is a very minor detail that you will not see without looking at close-ups. But it's there, I noticed it, I'm going to point it out. In addition, what I said earlier about the beveling on the sword and it being very cleanly done, it's in the transitions, in this O-drive curve to the tip, you can definitely see where they sharpened it a little bit more. The polish is a little bit different there. This is not a bad thing, and it's just kind of a fact of life when you have a curved tip like this. It's very rare to see these the edge blended in perfectly up there, in my experience. I'm going to test the edges on some paper, and as always, this is more about providing context for how sharp the sword is when you're about to see some cutting footage. It does also give you an idea of how sharp a sword can come from Albion Direct, since this is a new sword direct from Albion. And ideally, I would like to see the sword slice through the paper from the edge with very little effort. So it did struggle to start that cut a little bit, but not much. And then it did a pretty smooth and even slice through the paper. That's a pretty good edge. Let's try one more time. Yeah, so the true edge, that's this one, is definitely sharp enough to cut paper. That's a nice effective edge. And now let's test the false edge. It's a little awkward here because the guard gets in the way, but I think I can do it. And that looks like pretty much the exact same with the false edge. So this is a nicely sharpened sword. It is not crazy sharp. It's not going to do a ton of favors to me in the cutting because it is, while it is giving a smooth cut, it could be even smoother, but it is fully effectively sharp. So let's talk about cutting, and I'm going to start with water bottles, but I'm actually really going to start with just general impressions, and that is that this sword cuts exactly how I expected it to cut. What do I mean by that? Well, it's got an edge that is definitely sharp enough to cut, and a geometry that can make for a pretty good cutter. A relatively stiff blade, although there is some flex to it, but in my hands, not a particularly effective cutter. Not an ineffective cutter, but not a great cutter. But at the same time, I am not particularly great with one-handed swords. I think my cutting ability is considerably better when I'm using both hands. And single-handed swords, I don't really do a great job cutting with. Now, this is kind of bringing up something that I want to talk about, which is what makes for a good cut. What factors weigh into a good cut versus a bad cut, a good cutting sword versus a bad cutting sword. So this is my experience. Other people could disagree, and the order of importance I'm putting here is certainly up for debate. But in my opinion, there are three major factors, and I'm going in order of importance. So the first one is the most important. The first factor is technique. Your technique is the most important part of determining how well the sword's going to cut. Second factor is sharpness. The sharper a sword, the more effective it's going to be at cutting. And the third factor is blade geometry. The more specialized the sword is for cutting, the better it's going to generally be able to cut. Now, the less important ones can do some work making up for the more important aspects in terms of cutting performance. So if you have a very sharp sword that's very optimized for cutting, but your technique is not particularly great, you'll probably still be able to get some cuts. They're making up for your lack of technique, but it's never going to truly be a great cutter without good technique. On the other hand, if your sword's not particularly sharp, or it's very much a thrust focused, not really cut focused sword, really good technique can make that sword deliver outstanding cuts. You don't have to look any farther than looking at Philip Martin or any of the other outstanding cutters out there to see this in action. So all that's to say, this sword is sharp enough to cut, although it is not going to do me favors. It's not so sharp that it's going to make up for bad technique. And it's got a decent blade for cutting. But again, my technique here, not that great. So it's still able to cut. I have enough technique. It's still sharp enough. It's still got a decent enough blade geometry for cutting that I'm able to do some cuts and get some fun cuts on water bottles. But it's not really going to do the job for me. Now take everything I just said, and it goes double for tatami. Tatami is really where your technique does start to make a big difference. And in my hands, I was not able to get a single cut all the way through this mat. And I attribute that to my technique. I failed the sword. The sword is sharp enough to cut tatami, and it has good, definitely good enough geometry to cut tatami. And again, if my technique was on, it would have cut the tatami no problem. So this is my fault. That said, even with my fairly unrefined technique on the tatami, I still got some very deep cuts in there. And these would be devastating cuts on an unarmored person. So it's not like the sword was completely ineffective. It still was able to deliver deep cuts, just not all the way through, not clean. And that is, again, my fault, not the sword's. Overall, it's a fun sword to move around and cut with. And if you have the technique but to back it up, I think this would actually be a pretty effective cutter. Maybe not a competition level, but definitely a good cutter. All right, let's talk about handling and do some comparisons to this Doge. I recorded this section before looking up how to pronounce the Doge, so we're all going to have to listen to me call it the Doge a bunch of times through this. And I have some pretty interesting comparisons lined up for you. So let's first just talk about how it feels in the hand. It locks in my hand very, very well, especially if I wrap my finger around the guard and use this finger ring. It definitely locks the sword in the hand, and the sword is not going anywhere. But one of the interesting things is this is a relatively heavy hilt because it's got a big pommel, a larger than normal crossguard, so there's a good amount of weight in the hilt. But the sword only weighs 2 pounds and a little under 6 ounces, so that's a pretty lightweight sword, and it's balanced. Looks like it's balanced right about at this little protrusion. I don't know what to call that, but it looks like it's balanced right there, which is about 4 inches. Looks like about there. If we look at the flexibility, it's got a decent amount of flex, but it's certainly not floppy. And if we look at the percussion nodes, it's a beautiful spot right about there. A perfect spot for cutting, with the fact that there's not much profile taper to this blade and the fact that it's getting pretty thin out here. This is pretty well optimized for cutting overall geometry. And the tip is still pretty acute, so it can do some thrusting. However, this style of blade, it's definitely a little bit more cut focused. But in the hand, I swear this feels like a thrust-focused sword, especially if I wrap my finger around the guard. I feel like I can put the tip exactly where I want it, more so than pretty much any other arming sword I've used. This feels incredibly tip-focused, while still having some authority in the cut. So that's a really good blend of cutting and thrusting in the feel. I do really like the way that feels. And I can get a lot of speed pretty easily, and it gives me some pretty good sword wind. Not incredibly loud, but a good amount of sword wind. Now, one thing I noticed when using this sword that was not immediately intuitive to me, this is not something I ever would have guessed just from looking at the sword, is when I wrap my finger around the guard like that, I can't do false edge cuts the way I want to do them. You know, normally if I'm doing a false edge cut, I'm thumbing the blade, and that just gives it more support and gets the hand and wrist rotating in a way that is natural. When I wrap my finger around the blade, this is about the most I can do. I can't really thumb it correctly, and if I'm trying to rotate, you see I can't really do it. This is a terrible position. There's no structure there at all. So if I want to do a false edge cut while thumbing the blade, I actually have to take my finger out of the ring, really adjust my grip, and then I can do it pretty easily. When I do that, this feels great for delivering false edge cuts. It feels very nimble, very more so than I am used to in arming swords. So that's great. It's just adjusting that grip takes a moment. It's not something I can quickly adjust on the fly. I can, but it's a little bit clunky for me. That's my experience. And if it's something that you haven't trained with a lot, it might be a little clunky for you too. And it's also possible that my technique here is terrible, or that the flexibility of my wrist is off, or whatever. This is my experience with this sword that I'm talking about here. A couple other things I want to touch on before getting to the comparisons. I've seen some people say that this handguard is too close to the grip. I don't find that at all. I can easily get my hand in here, and I have never once had a single problem with this. Not a problem at all in my hands again. The other thing I want to talk about, I don't have the Albion Kern that I reviewed last year with me. That belongs to Vic over at Unsheathed Sword Reviews. It would be great to be able to compare them in the hand, but I will talk a little bit about how my memory of the Kern compares to the Doge. And the first thing I'm going to say is that the Doge feels incredibly nimbler than the Kern did. The Kern had a point of balance close to 7 inches, if I remember right. And even though it was around 6 to 7 ounces lighter than I remember, if I remember right, this feels lighter and more nimble. And a huge part of that is, look at that hilt. This hilt has a lot more weight to it. The Kern has a very lightweight hilt. So the Kern is a much more cut-focused sword. Even though it's very light, it has a lot of blade presence to it. Whereas the Doge feels very well balanced. And like I said, it honestly feels a little more tip-focused than I was expecting. But they are incredibly different feeling swords. So if you are debating between one of the multiple Type 19s that Albion offers, don't go just off looks unless the handling is not particularly important to you, because they, at least these two, the Doge and the Kern, handle wildly differently. For my first comparison to the Doge, I have here the Albion Kingmaker. And I chose this because these would have been relatively contemporary swords. The Kingmaker and the Doge would have seen use in the probably mid-15th century, maybe a little earlier, maybe a bit later, right around there. So they are relatively contemporary, and I wanted to see how they feel compared to each other. Now the Kingmaker weighs about 6 ounces more than the Doge, and it feels it, especially in the hilt. What's interesting, this hilt doesn't look particularly heavy, but it has a good amount of weight to it. It's got a big pommel, and the crossguard is a bit thicker than it may look just in profile. But the blade is also very stout. If we look at it, there's not a whole lot of vibrations to it. It's not very flexible. This is a stout blade, very different feeling than the Doge. It still has good tip control, but it definitely has less in my hands than the Doge. But yeah, this has a lot more authority in the cut to it, just because it has so much more weight overall. 6 ounces may not sound like a lot, but when you're talking about a sword, it makes a big difference. And the Kingmaker has just a lot more presence to it everywhere. But especially back here, this pommel feels heavy. Just the whole hilt feels hefty, but so does the blade. It's a really interesting feel, but it also generates a ton of sword wind. So the Kingmaker is very much, I would say it's got about the same balance of cut and thrust. Well, no, not the same. I would say this is a little more feeling cut focused than thrust, but it's probably actually a better thruster because that's a more acute point and a more rigid blade. But it has a bit more of a cut feel to it. And now for the other comparison to the Doge, I have here the LKChen Munich Town Guard sword. And the reason I chose this one is this is kind of the successor to the Doge in some ways. This I would consider to be kind of a proto side sword, maybe not quite a side sword, but getting there. This would be almost a side sword into proto rapier kind of, but definitely kind of developed past what the Doge was. And I figured that'd be an interesting comparison. This would have been more like early 1600s, so definitely a later period than the Doge. And what's should be immediately obvious is that this has a lot of weight in the hilt. It's a much more complex hilt than even the Doge, which is a pretty complex hilt as far as medieval swords go. This also weighs considerably more overall at around 3 pounds 3 ounces. So we're talking, what, that's like 13 ounces, somewhere around there. So considerably more weight than the Doge. But interesting is that, yeah, the tip on this feels very maneuverable. About the same as the Doge, I'd say. But it also has a really good feel for cutting. And honestly, it's going to sound kind of funny. You know what this reminds me of? This feels like the Doge, but heavier. So that's an interesting take on it, but it really does. It has a very similar tip control, about the same amount of authority in the cut. It has the, you wrap your finger around the side guard. Just like the Doge, I need to take my finger out of the ring to be able to do a false edge cut. So yeah, this feels a lot like the Doge. You can see it looks like it's about the same stiffness as the Kingmaker. Let's see. A little bit more flexible than the Kingmaker, but definitely more rigid than the Doge. So it's probably going to be a more effective thruster, especially when you consider that the tip geometry is definitely more thrust focused. And the blade out here at the center of percussion is going to be a little bit less cut focused than the Doge because it's definitely not quite as wide. Although this still has definitely enough width to be a very effective cutter. So overall, I really like the way the Doge feels in the hand, the way it moves around, the way it swings. It is a fun sword to move around and just a fun sword to pick up and admire for that matter. It has a pretty unique feel to it, although, like I said, to me it actually feels quite similar in tip placement and authority in the cut to the Munich Town Guard from LKChen. So that is, if you want to get the idea of kind of what the Doge handles like, that's not a bad comparison. Now, admittedly, this is a much, much lighter sword than the Town Guard, so it's not going to be an exact comparison. And again, this is my opinion of how they feel. Doesn't mean that other people will have that same opinion. But I think it actually has a fairly similar feel that might help inform you of, if you're interested in the Doge but want to have an idea of how it handles, getting a chance to handle an LKChen Munich Town Guard sword will give you at least somewhat of an idea. Bottom line, this sword would set you back $1,518. What do you get for that price? Well, you get, to put it bluntly, one of the most attractive swords Albion has, in my opinion, of course. I love the overall look of this. The blade is beautifully executed, and the design of the blade is gorgeous. The hilt, I love the way this sword flows. Everything about it just flows very naturally. It's such an attractive sword. You get a sword of the type that you don't see very many of on the reproduction market. You can't find very many good Type 19s out there. Albion's one of your only bets, and they do have multiple Type 19s, so you do have your choice of aesthetic if you want one of them. You get a sword that has a good amount of cutting ability while still also being able to do some thrusting. Not a ton, but a ton of tip control and, in my opinion, the exact right amount of cutting power with the blade presence. It just handles beautifully. It looks beautiful. This sword has a little bit something extra to it to me. So I think it's pretty obvious that from what I've just been gushing that, yes, I absolutely think this sword is worth the asking price if you're interested in this type of sword. If this is not your cup of tea, if you don't really like this late medieval, early Renaissance style, then no, this sword's not going to be worth it to you, I don't think. But for me, I love that aesthetic, and I do really like the way this sword looks, the way it handles, just everything about it. Even though in my hands, it wasn't a particularly competent cutter, I blame that much, much more on my skills than the sword. I am confident that with good technique, this sword will be a very good cutter. It's not going to be a competition level cutter, but it's going to be a very good cutter. So yeah, obviously, I do think it's worth that price. And if you want to get one of the Type 19s, I do recommend trying to find a way to compare them, because let me tell you, this sword handles nothing like the Kern. And this is a much more balanced sword. And when I say balanced, I don't mean in terms of like correct balance or anything like that. I mean, it's more balanced between cut and thrust, while the Kern was much more focused on the cut with the much further out point of balance. While I did really enjoy reviewing the Kern, and I think that's an excellent sword, I do really like the Doge better. It speaks to me a bit more, both aesthetically and the way it handles and feels. I am very curious how the Machiavelli and the Condottiere would handle and compare to both the Kern and the Doge. I do have some pretty vague plans to eventually get a Machiavelli with a very specific style and a whole plan there, but they're pretty vague at this point, so no clue when that's going to happen. And that's going to wrap up my review. A huge thank you to sword friend Pellius for allowing me to hold on to this sword for several months in order to get this reviewed out. It's going to be on its way to you very soon. For everybody else, this is the last loaner or proxy bot sword from SoCal Sword Fight. I feel like I've been doing these forever, but I'm not complaining. I love reviewing Albions. They are a lot of fun, even when they may not be particularly speak to me. I still really enjoy reviewing them. But now that I have got through that backlog of loaner swords, I am going to be able to start reviewing some of my swords for the most part. There's still one more loaner coming up relatively soon. But the next review is going to be the Angus Trim designed Kingston Arms 13A. And if you've watched my shorts recently, you've seen it featured in several of them. There's a lot going on with that sword, so you are really going to want to check out the full review coming up in 2 weeks. Until next time, Alien Toot out.